Sometimes I have the misfortune to think about Star Wars. I finally sat down and watched The Acolyte, something I was reluctant to do because I knew that it would upset me. And it did. Not only because it was poorly paced, poorly written, and then unceremoniously canceled, a second season would have been a great place to fix things. Most Star Trek shows are bad for multiple seasons with 5 times the episodes. But it also bothered me how Disney keeps throwing things into the canon of Star Wars without any consideration of how it builds upon the tapestry of that world. And when I allow myself to think about Star Wars canon, I end up thinking about Star Wars Legends. Star Wars is an interesting franchise because while it exists in my mind primarily as a film franchise, it has branches in comics, novels, video games, and TV. Hell, even early on, even before the first film, there was a story idea made that would have continued the story of Star Wars if it hadn't become successful. It's called Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. It has been well loved and got a little water damaged. The alternative canon of Star Wars that exists in this novelization is a world where Luke and Leia are not siblings. Leia actually gets to fight Vader with a lightsaber. Luke is not related to Vader, and because Harrison Ford had not signed up for other movies, this was written with no guarantee that Han would exist further, so he is not featured in this work, so there is no Han and Leia. It is a version of Star Wars that at one point in our timeline could have been canon, but it was a massive success, and so this is comfortably a what-if tale. After the Star Wars trilogy came out, the continuation of Star Wars took place heavily in what was called the Star Wars Expanded Universe, of which this book is the first. The Star Wars Expanded Universe were licensed stories within Star Wars that existed from the 1970s to 2014. The universe included stories millennia before the Republic was created and over 100 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. These books were always contentious canon-wise, so a tier was made up: G, T, C, S, and N. G was absolute canon and overruled anything else when there was conflict between outside texts. This included the movies, novelizations, and anything proclaimed by George Lucas. T, essentially television, was the Clone Wars television series. C was continuity, and it made up the broad strokes of the EU. S was for secondary canon, things that were older materials that didn't necessarily fit into current continuity, but were still impactful and painting the world of Star Wars. And N was non-canon works that were not canon at all according to Lucasfilm. Dave Filoni, who is known for working on the Clone Wars animated films and also worked on Avatar: The Last Airbender, said, "People get into all these debates of what's canon and what's not, and sometimes forget the special nature of telling a good story and creating great characters. Part of the fan debate in the past always used to be what's canon, what's not, because there was George and we always knew George was the canon. I look at it very broadly and I just say there's a love of Star Wars because I knew George, I worked with him, and none of us are going to be him, but we love the galaxy he created and we're very much a product of it, growing up with it." Within that lore, characters popped up and some became really popular. Mara Jade was always one of my favorites. She was created by Timothy Zahn, who also created Grand Admiral Thrawn, who did make it into proper canon through the Clone Wars series. Mara Jade was a former assassin for Palpatine who ended up falling in love with Luke, became a Jedi, they got married, had kids together. Badass redhead assassin warrior woman. You can understand why she was popular. So popular that IGN ranked her the 19th best Star Wars character back in the 2000s out of 100, and she was ranked above Qui-Gon Jinn, and he was in a movie. The most casual Star Wars fan knows who Qui-Gon Jinn is. They probably don't know who Mara Jade was. But if you cared about Star Wars, you were a big Star Wars fan, even if you didn't know every aspect of this, you knew certain things about this expanded universe. But of course, that all changed when Disney took over Lucasfilm and bought it out. For over 35 years, the expanded universe has enriched the Star Wars experience for fans seeking to continue the adventure beyond what is seen on the screen. When he created Star Wars, George Lucas Lucas built a universe that sparked the imagination and inspired others to create. He opened up that universe to be a creative space for other people to tell their own tales. This became the expanded universe, or EU, of comics, novels, video games, and more. While Lucasfilm has always strived to keep the stories created for the EU consistent with our film and television content, as well as internally consistent, Lucas has always made it clear that he was not beholden to the EU. He set the films he created as the canon. This includes the 6 Star Wars episodes and the many hours of content he developed and produced in Star Wars: The Clone Wars. These stories are the immovable objects of Star Wars history, the characters and events to which all other tales must align. Now, with an exciting future filled with new cinematic installments of Star Wars, all aspects of Star Wars storytelling moving forward will be connected. Under Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy's direction, the company for the first time ever has formed a story group to oversee and coordinate all Star Wars creative development. Well, we all saw how that ended up, didn't we?
Confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned. Some goddamn money!
And they have succeeded in vivisecting parts of the expanded universe, sometimes so painfully close that you can tell they just didn't want to pay for the rights to these characters from the writers who created them, even though it would have been much easier than just making an entire shitty sequel series with no outline. Justice for the Solo twins.
We have to face one hard reality as a country. The new Star Wars was not as good as everyone thought it was.
These works are still in circulation, but are no longer canon and have been branded as legends. They are Star Wars, but not Star Wars, because essentially the company that owns Star Wars, Disney, gets to decide what is really Star Wars, what is canon, what is the ultimate truth.
All right, now get out there and make me some goddamn money!
This is not a Star Wars video, I promise. The word canon derives from the Greek word for rule, and in most cases refers to a collection of rules about works, art, religion that are approved by whatever ruling body is in charge of dictating said thing. Canon is sometimes fairly simple, and sometimes it's complicated. For example, let's take the Dune franchise.
In the shadows of Arrakis lie many secrets.
The Dune novels were written by Frank Herbert, but he passed away before completing the entire series. Written by him, we have Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. Chapter House ends on a cliffhanger, and so Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, and author Kevin J. Anderson finished the series with Hunters of Dune, which came out in 2006, and Sandworms of Dune, which came out in 2007, based on notes left behind by Frank Herbert. However, if you go and buy a box set of the Dune books, like for example this one, they will usually not include those books in that box set. Yet they are technically still canonical additions to the series because Brian Herbert is the executor of the estate and he gets to decide that, and he's doing it based on notes by his father, which make it as close to canon as it can be without being written by Herbert. However, fans make their own call, and publishers. You can ultimately decide to not accept any of those stories as true canon because they were not written by Herbert, and you can find plenty of people who would agree with you on that and either don't like them or completely dismiss them. That also extends to the prequel series that exist, of which there are quite a lot of them, but I never really hear people, unless they are just hardcore completists, really talk about those. What's curious about Dune's stature is that it has not penetrated popular culture in the way that The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars have. There are no Dune conventions, catchphrases from the book have not entered the language. Nevertheless, the novel has produced a cottage industry of sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, the production of which only accelerated after Herbert's death in 1986. There are now 18 novels in the Dune Chronicles, not to mention screen adaptations, comic books, and countless board, video, and role-play games. The conversion of Dune into a franchise, while pleasing readers and earning royalties for the Herbert estate, has gone a long way towards obscuring the power of the original novels. And I've had conversations about why I think that obscuration happens, and part of it is, hashtag media literacy, hashtag people don't want to deal with Paul being a white savior, even if it is deconstructing it. Different mediums make this kind of distinction and separation more complicated, especially comics.
Tell me. Do you bleed?
Comics is probably the most frustrating to love a character because depending on the writer, the artist, the politics, and the corporate overlords,
All right, now get out there and make me some goddamn money.
you can see everything you love destroyed in an instant. In some cases, it can make a character change fundamentally from run to run. Wonder Woman is kind of infamous for this. I have skipped entire runs of Wonder Woman because I didn't like how the Amazons were depicted. I'm a George Perez girl, so I prefer when Diana is molded from sand and is just a pure sand baby versus being like the daughter of Zeus or Heracles as she is sometimes presented. Her personality, her bloodlust, reference to the gods, skin tone changes all the time. And that not only makes her harder to adapt, but also makes her a character in constant flux. Even though Batman and Superman do change from time to time depending on who's writing them, their entire backstories don't just change depending on who's writing them. But I will say, because there are enough popular depictions of Wonder Woman, there was still sort of a true idea of a Wonder Woman. Depending on what age you are, it could either be Linda Carter, it would be maybe now for a lot of people the DCEU, which for me, it'll probably always be the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited Wonder Woman.
Yes, that's really Wonder Woman, ladies and gentlemen. It is on!
Plus, George Perez are kind of my personal true Wonder Woman. But then you also get characters who just get screwed, and then that's it. It's still canon.
Beloved?
Talia al Ghul comes to mind.
Me and your son.
Talia al Ghul is the daughter of Batman villain Ra's al Ghul. Racially ambiguous icons. You can see this video for more on that. Talia has always been one of Batman's top tier roster girls as a love interest, yet for some reason, Grant Morrison decided that not only were they gonna have a kid together, which, you know, it's always hard to give a superhero a kid, especially a kid that really sticks. Shout out to Helena Wayne. But Morrison decided that they were going to write it so that she was going to sexually assault Batman in order to have their son, Damian Wayne. Morrison said in an interview, "I will admit, however, that Talia in those stories dosed the Cape Crusader with something from her arsenal resembling some combination of MDMA and Viagra, and doubtless some ingredients of her own devising. She can't help being the devil's daughter after all." Wow. I was so gutted by this because Morrison wrote All-Star Superman, and that's my comfort comic. I'm so happy to hear that it's the inspiration for the upcoming movie, but I was so mad about this. I love Morrison's work, but I was very mad at them for this decision. And this is canon. It has been at times retconned or softened, but by the word of the person who wrote it, that is what happened. And mind you, for a long time, I didn't know that's what happened. And I like Talia. I enjoy her dynamic with Batman. I think they do a good job making it different from his dynamic with Selina. I think that good writers can highlight the appeal that they have for one another. Emphasis on good writers. Plus, Damian has grown on me. I like that, you know, Bruce Wayne technically has like a super mixed race Arab kid. Like, I think that's kind of neat.
Damian,
Look, I understand. This never-ending mission of ours is a lonely endeavor. If this trollop provides some carnal release, so be it. But I needn't bring up your past poor choices in women, including but not limited to my mother, for I must insist that you use protection. And another thing, cover your drink.
Goodbye, Damian.
But if I say that I like Talia, if Talia comes up in conversation, people will bring this up. And I can say I ignore that characterization because I feel it's disingenuous to the character. But it doesn't change that it happened. But this is also what happens when characters go from different writers. And also, depending on how popular that run might be for any reason, it impacts the readers into believing this is who this character is. This is the canon of this character. Writers for characters like Superman, Scott Summers, and Captain America. At some point, all of these good boys seem to be written by people who just did not want to believe that they were actually good.
No one stays good in this world.
You will have generations of fans of the series X-Men who don't understand why Scott Summers is the leader of the X-Men, because for some reason, for a long time, people just really wrote poor Scott with such deep, deep fascist undertones. And I don't know what he did to deserve that. Scott Summers is not a fascist. It's very weird.
You're ungrateful.
I've spent a lot of time talking about canon from the pop culture perspective, but taking what we have discussed, I want to make a teeny, itty, bitty pivot to talk about American history and God. Just a tiny little pivot. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, I learned almost everything I knew about American history from the PBS show Liberty's Kids. The theme song was by Aaron Carter. It slapped. Except for the rapping. That part was very weird.
I take my heart into battle, give that freedom bell rattle, get my independent sign, declare it on the dotted line.
And the series tracked these 4 fictional characters and Ben Franklin through the lead up to the American Revolution, the revolution itself, and then a bit of little sprinkling of post-independence. The cast was stacked. They really got people out there for this show. And then you have the character of Sarah, who is British, who starts off as kind of a loyalist and then slowly becomes a supporter of the revolution. You have James, who's very pro the colonies, even to a point where he condones mob violence.
Let me do a story on the sailor that got tarred and feathered. That's real news, patriotic and funny.
You have Henri. He's French, and Moses, a former slave who bought his freedom and now works for Ben Franklin. When I was thinking about this, I realized that it was interesting to watch the series in tandem with being taught American history via the social studies books that I was reading, and finding the PBS series to be more nuanced than the textbooks I was reading. Liberty's Kids talked about slavery explicitly and how there were Black loyalists who fought for England because they promised freedom, and how the issue of slavery was a really big issue and why some Black people fought for England. It talked about the suffering that the Native Americans dealt with. It was critical of tar and feathering and was as explicit as you could get about what that experience would be, and some of the mob mentalities that get glorified when you're just doing a overview of the history. And it was at the same time that I was learning American history in probably the most nuanced way possible via PBS. I was also beginning what was going to be a very long crisis of faith. Yes, I had one at 11. I wasn't doing anything else.
Well, firstly, I lack the spiritual depth to be Pope.
I've mentioned before that I went to Catholic school growing up, and at 7th and 8th grade is when Catholic students start getting ready to take communion, and you start learning about catechism, which is the reference work that summarizes the Catholic doctrine. And while I was not gonna do communion because I'm Episcopalian, it was still interesting to be learning about an idea of God, what God wanted expected in Catholic school, among Catholics, cosplaying a Catholic essentially, while also being excluded from what was being presented to me as the closest relationship you could have with God. And when you were watching people supposedly being given the body and blood of Christ, and you were made to sit there and just kind of watch because you're not the right denomination, it causes you to ask questions. And when you ask those questions, you realize that all these things that you think are just like biblical truth are a lot more complicated than that. The Bible, right? The sacred religious text is made up of books that are biblical canon. And I remembered learning that people decided that. And then, of course, that makes you ask, so you can just take stuff out. But this book is the product of divine inspiration. Why do you get to decide that some of it isn't worth being in there? And then you get into the many divides of like Catholic and Christianity that makes it even more complicated, because there are those who believe that the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority, and some people consider that heresy. I was at a big age when I realized that the King James Bible was not the only Bible. It wasn't until I was working at Barnes and Nobles and people were asking for like different versions of the Bible that I was like, wait. It was like all the deluxe editions of the Tortured Poets Society. I didn't know how many were out there. Huge twist. And the King James Bible itself was political. It was sponsored by King James VI of Scotland and First of England, son of Mary Queen of Scots, who was Catholic, but he was Protestant. And he made a Protestant Bible because he wanted them to have an English Bible that would become the root of the Anglican Church. To quote this article by Sarah Pruitt from history.com, by the time James took the throne, many people in England at the time were hearing one version of the Bible when they went to church, but were reading from another when they were at home. While one version of Christianity's holy text, the so-called Bishop's Bible, was read in churches, the most popular version among Protestant reformers in England at the time was the Geneva Bible, which had been created in that city by a group of Calvinist exiles during the bloody reign of Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary I. For the new king, the Geneva Bible posed a political problem, since it contained certain annotations questioning not only the bishop's power, but his own. So, in 1604, when a Puritan scholar proposed the creation of a new translation of the Bible at a meeting at a religious conference at Hampton Court, James surprised him by agreeing. Over the next 7 years, 47 scholars and theologians worked to translate the different books of the Bible, the Old Testament from Hebrew, the New Testament from Greek, and the Apocrypha from Greek and Latin. Much of the resulting translation drew on the work of the Protestant reformer William Tyndale, who had produced the first New Testament translation from Greek to English in 1525, but was executed for heresy less than a decade later. Go woke, go broke, as they would say. Obviously JK, and I do love the fun fact that even though he was this reformer, he still opposed the annulment between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon in favor of Anne Boleyn, who was more of a reformer, for like a bunch of like papal related reasons. But as a Catherine of Aragon fan, I say slay. And growing up, I would just see the King James Bible referenced so much that I never thought it was a specific kind of Bible. I just thought it was the Bible. If the Word of God is subject to interpretation and copyright from different denominations and different groups of men, what are we doing here? And just to touch back on it, good King James, that man was a bisexual who hated women. So I don't know what business he had sponsoring anything, but I guess when you're the supreme head of the church, your pussy can do whatever you want, allegedly, because some historians don't think it was sexual, but they like to say that. Throughout our lives, we're constantly being forced to realize that very little of what we thought was absolute truth is. And our ability to accept that and grow in the face of those little betrayals is important. And I know betrayal sounds like an extreme word, but I use that word because it does kind of like reshuffle your brain. It does sort of feel like you were being tricked for your own good, and that sucks. It's not fun to feel like you were learning something and this is the absolute truth, and then it's like, gotcha, Talia is a rapist. The way I grew up learning history and the way many of us grew up learning it, it was just set down in this path of general knowledge. If you want to go deeper, you can, but you learn, in America anyway, the American history canon, and you just go forth, and that's what you know. As a kid in America, you grow up hearing the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Little George Washington gets a hatchet for a gift, and he like lightly chops on his father's cherry tree. His father's upset. It's like, who did this? And baby George is like, I cannot tell a lie, father. I cut the cherry tree. And it's this whole parable about not telling lies and how great George Washington is. And it's regurgitated in songs, comics, movies, films about him. It gets brought up all the time, and it's a lie. It's a straight up lie that was made up by Mason Locke Weems, who wrote one of the first biographies for him in 1800 after Washington died. And he made up the story in the 5th edition to sell books, to craft an image of Washington being this virtuous man. And even though it is not true, it shows up in Tales About Washington and solidified Weems's biography as a key one. Lincoln references Weems' biography on Washington. And so you grow up hearing this very quaint story of the first president of the United States being someone who was so virtuous and noble that he didn't lie to his father about nicking a tree. But you don't hear the actual history of how he had to move his slaves every few months out of Philadelphia and back to Virginia because it was illegal for slaves to be in Philadelphia for more than 3 months or they automatically became free. And when one of them did escape, he spent years hunting her down because of his bruised ego. That we know happened. The cherry tree is bullshit because once you talk about George Washington as a slave owner, that most of the founding founders were slave owners, you then have to start unraveling all the things that we are taught are the rules, the truth of what our American foundations are. And then you get told, well, at the time, everyone was okay with it.
Every word of what you just said was wrong.
People were not okay about it. Notable second President John Adams did not own slaves. There were abolitionists.
To this point of class, I just want to highlight one of my favorite little tidbits is that during the Revolutionary War in Virginia, there was an attempt to get more poor white people to fight in the war by offering them not just land, but an enslaved person as well in order to till the land. And James Madison, the father of the Constitution, prominent slave owner himself, said, does that really make sense? Should we be offering people, enslaved people, in order to fight for a war of independence? Now, he wasn't giving up his slaves, as he was himself a slave owner and born into a prominent slave-owning planter family in Virginia. But as many of the intellectuals of this period have shown through their letters, they were all very aware that slavery was bad. They just knew they weren't going to do the work themselves. Madison, for example, did view slavery to be the most oppressive dominion that ever existed. However, despite favoring a bill for gradual abolition of slavery, which was put in as early as 1785 by Thomas Jefferson of all people, the reality is that they felt as if there was no way to do this practically that would not gut the economy of the South. So please do not let anyone trick you into believing that these men were not very much aware that this was a bad institution, even those who owned slaves.
Our northern brethren, feeling a bit tender toward our slaves. They don't keep slaves. Oh, no. But they're willing to be considerable carriers of slaves to others.
And yes, you can read very giant books written by David McCullough to counteract a narrative, but is the average person really gonna do that? It's much sexier to just imagine the American Revolution and everything dealing with it as this noble pursuit for freedom and not maybe the 1% of agrarians trying to keep their money with a little bit of, theological chutzpah. And this is not shade because I'm not anti the American Revolution besides the slavery bits. I've actually argued with a friend of mine when we were kind of doing a tier list of revolutions. I put the American Revolution as an A-tier revolution. We did that shit. We did that shit. I love 1776.
What sort of bird shall we choose as the symbol of our new America?
The eagle.
The dove. The turkey.
We always say history is written by the winners, but someone has to then codify what winning means. Someone then has to write that down, and how they choose to write down the winner's story matters. The Western canon is one of my favorite subjects to yap about because I love it. I have a tattoo of the Iliad on my arm, but it's also a mess. It's a mess because so much of it is rooted in European exceptionalism. It also has a very odd way of how it decides what the West is, West the what? Yet I do think it's a fun place to share collective understanding, a basis to branch conversations from, to challenge the canon from within itself, to connect it beyond the geographical superficiality of the West, and instead just think about it as a canon of human intellect and progress and thought and flaw. Studying history and literature has always been fun for me because I like realizing what I don't know, asking more questions, seeing how the sausage gets made, seeing who are the architects of the stories that we have told ourselves is the truth. Changing my opinion when I hear better facts. Whenever people say that DEI or critical race theory will make you hate white people or white men or men in general, I just think, those people think with a very narrow idea of human existence, or just think very little of men and white people. TM. History is filled with men and women, white and non-white, who have stood against the grain. We just don't teach about them or properly put them into context, because what people are afraid of is not dealing with the history of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. They're worried about grandma and grandpa. The white people who spat on black children going to school, who lynched black people, Chinese people, Jewish people, who picnicked under burned bodies, who stopped them from owning property, don't have centuries of history to buffer them in the human timeline. They're right here. Ruby Bridges is 70 years old. Ruby Bridges is 8 years younger than sitting President Donald Trump. When history told us that racism is bad, it tries to place racism in the far-flung past. But it's not the far-flung past. It's your grandma, your grandpa, your uncle, your father, your mother. And they could have been a racist. We have been seeing the erasure of history before our eyes. And I think that if those who say they are Republican and don't like big government, I would ask, why are you comfortable allowing the government and unelected people to erase history just for your comfort? Why do you feel the need for it to be so true, so badly, that you will ignore the pain of others, scientific facts, literal words coming out of people's mouths? Because that's easier than accepting you're mistaken. When I started crafting this video, the first thing that came to my mind to describe canon for like a mainstream audience was fandom, and then God. Two things that seem like distant but are so heavily linked in my own mind because of my own background and how I feel about both. History came about in the conversation just from talking about comics, because if you look at the history of like any of the big three DC heroes, you can see how politics, especially war, gender, labor, and capitalism, deeply impact them, their design, their perception in the eyes of audiences. If you go back and read about Superman from his first era, where he's like actively dealing with like union busters, working class issues, it's so separate in some ways from the larger than life adaptations that we've seen of the character in modern day, especially when you consider how post World War II, he really did become this American icon more so than he was before. As someone who studies pop culture, uses it as a jumping off point to discuss larger issues, part of why I enjoy doing that is because sometimes it allows people to almost depersonalize their own experiences and simply examine the thing being said. And what this video is more than anything is hopefully a jumping off point for other discussions of how media literacy in general, is more than just accepting like the word of God as everything. We've had a lot of people say, sometimes something is blue because it's just blue, and we've reduce the idea that like you can think about context, you can analyze it from just language, you can analyze all of these works through multiple lenses. I think Harold Bloom's concept of the schools of resentment is very flawed, but we will discuss that in another video. And I think it's just important to
talk about what canon means in a broader way as a way of dealing with how we are told stories, told history, told religion, and the conversations that come out of that. Whenever I meet someone who doesn't like Superman because he's a fascist, I always want to ask them, like, well, what Superman have you read? What adaptations of Superman define that for you? And it's always like an Elseworld story, or, you know, fucking Frank Miller's Batman comic. And it's like, that's literally a handful of things. Death of the author is a good concept when it comes to textual analysis to a certain degree, but when it comes to power, who's holding the keys to them, who is deciding the rules, it is important to know the architects of the propaganda you passively consume. Now, as I said before, this is not a Star Wars video, but I do need to get that space sci-fi fix somewhere that isn't just restricted to movies and television by Disney. The audio cinema story Faithless, A Sojourn Story has been a really fun listening experience, while I've been longing for the thrills of something like Star Wars. The Nebula original is well acted, produced, and stars Stephen Trafford as Castian Vardic, our hero turned outlaw, as well as Nebula's own Abigail Thorne and Baldur's Gate 3's Emma Gregory, aka Minthara. It is compelling, entertaining originals like this that make Nebula so unique. You aren't just supporting one or two people, but a whole library of artistic and educational pursuits. Nebula is a creator-owned platform that gives them the ability to make the projects they care about without endless guidelines. You don't have to take down a video and then re-upload it constantly because certain companies love to copyright strike without any context. It is a collection of some of my favorite creators, projects, and has been ever branching out into other creative endeavors only found on Nebula. You can use my link, nebula.tv/princessweeks, to get an amazing 40% off, an annual subscription, and be part of the adventure. And now Nebula also has guest passes, so if you're a subscriber, once a month you'll have the opportunity to share Nebula with someone else. So thank you for all your support. Thank you for watching to the very end of this video. Whether you're trying to find your sci-fi fix or just deep dive into topics across the board, Nebula is the place for you.